Hey everyone, welcome to Bible and Archaeology Live. I'm Jordan Jones, here as usual with Bob Cargill. We're so happy to have you with us on this Friday. We hope you had a great week. We're happy to see you again here at an evening slot. Next week we're going to be moving back to 11, so we've been happy to see you here in the evenings. If you're tuning in just at the beginning, 11 o'clock next Friday, we'll be back in that afternoon. But Bob, happy Friday. Good to see you.
Happy Friday.
We are going to jump right into our topic this week because we have a lot to cover. And so if
Yeah.
you're thinking, I want some news, as always, go over to Bible and Archaeology. You can stay up to date with the news there. But today
Mhm.
we have a really big topic to get into. Scribal editing, redaction, revision, tinkering, depending on who you are, you may want to call it a different thing. And this is a huge topic. This is a
Yeah.
huge topic. So by no means are we going to touch everything.
Right. And keep in mind, scribal practices, the things that scribes do, this is becoming an increasingly popular topic. And this is literary criticism. This
Yeah.
is something that not all people who read the Bible accept,
Yes.
but it's something that absolutely happens to the text of the Bible. And so we want to show you some examples of things that scholars say, and not just modern scholars,
Right.
ancient scholars, rabbis, going way, 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 way back, have said, we think something's happened to the text here. By the way, there's a lot of new books, monographs coming out talking about scribal practices, scribal schools. And so over the next few months, we hope to be highlighting, interviewing some people who've
Hmm.
authored some of these books. So this is a big topic, and we want to introduce this to you today.
Yeah, you could think of this as, yes, your introduction, one of many. And so if you really like this, great, stay tuned. You'll get more from us. If you have questions off of this, as always, you can submit them live as we go. If you're watching on replay, put them in the comments down below for future interviews. Or you can always contact us at our email, Bible-Archaeology. All of that's down in the description. But as Bob said, there's a lot going on here, and we're going to go through a couple big examples, maybe some examples you're familiar with to help introduce this topic. But I think as always, we need to set some definitions, Bob. And so a title that you normally see here, a title that's in the title for this video, biblical redaction. What are we talking about, Bob, when we're talking about biblical redaction, maybe versus, composition or editing? How do these terms get used by scholars to mean different things?
Yeah. So let's say your teacher, professor in school asks you to write something. Hey, I want you to write about what you did this summer. And so you sit down and you write, and you begin, you pick up your pencil and you put pencil to paper and you start writing. And then you hand it in. You say, "Here you go, I'm done." And your teacher says, "This is very good, but maybe you want to look at this, make some changes, maybe, edit it a little bit. This is just your first draft." Man, I used to hate that. This is a good first draft,
This is your
but
first draft, right? This wasn't
right,
this
right,
that comment
exactly.
when you thought this was your final draft?
I thought I was done. Um, this is the idea of, okay, I need to take what I've got and I need to make it better. I need to improve it. Now, sometimes that's cutting material out. That I don't need this paragraph. I don't need this sentence. This word is superfluous. I can get rid of this. Other times it's expanding. It's taking a piece and, well, I need to say this better. Sometimes it's rewording something. All of this editing, this is this process of what we talk about scribal editing, redacting, cutting it down, making it better. Think of it as what you do with your second and your third draft, especially if you work at a newspaper, if you're a journalist. It's an economy of words.
Hmm.
And so you're bringing this down and you're trying to make it not just for fewer words, sometimes more words, but you're trying to make it better and you're improving it for many different purposes.
And when you mentioned at the opening here, this is something not everyone is comfortable with or accepts. This is
Right.
one of those reasons why, because as we're talking about this may be pushing up against some ideas of authorship
Right.
or composition that people hold, because the idea of redaction is dependent on the idea that the text didn't float down in a completed form, or wasn't written, the Torah wasn't all written by Moses in one sitting on one day, but that this is that long process that we're seeing here in these edits with the additions, corrections, or removals, right?
Right. So yes, it's a it's a holy book. It's the Word of God. This is this is a Bible, and yet the Hebrew Bible, even the Christian New Testament in a more compact sense, but the Hebrew Bible was written by many, many, many different authors over a very long period of time. And in addition to that, it was redacted. It had other people that came in and said, great, let's compile. Let's put these together. Let's put this here. Let's move this and rearrange this. And then other people came in and said, nice, good job, but let's change this. Let's move this. I don't like the way that, I think we want to fix this. And then other people came along later and said, yeah, we can't say that. I just don't accept that. And so we're going to change this letter or this word, or we're going to flip this around. This is what happened. And a lot of people don't accept this because this is the Word of God. What do you mean you're changing the Word of God? And this is a difficult thing for some people because of their view of inspiration, because of their a preconceived notion of how we got the Bible itself. That it's either it just floated down from heaven as a whole, or that God spoke it into existence, or that one person, Moses, wrote the whole thing. It's just not how we got it. We have traditions that say that, but that's not the reality. And what we want to do is show some examples of how we know this. And there are hundreds, if not thousands, of examples of this. And this is what, by the way, what we call textual criticism or literary criticism. This is what you and I and scholars all across the nation do on a regular basis. But just understand that it's a form of biblical study. We call it criticism. It's not like you suck. It's not like that. It's inquiry. It's
right.
Examination is maybe a better word.
When it's reading the text critically.
Yeah, it's reading it and saying, well, why does it say that there and not that over here? The simplest thing to do is just read Samuel and Kings, and then read Chronicles, which is a retelling of Samuel and Kings. If it's retelling it, it should just be a rewrite of it. Why are there changes? Why don't they match perfectly? Why does it say this over here? Because Chronicles itself is a form of rewriting the text.
That just gets included within the text.
And if there's a difference, you're saying, well, why did Chronicles change this over here? Which one of these is correct? A lot of these biblical contradictions that we read about are Samuel and Kings versus Chronicles. Which is it? That's a form of it. Pretend you're doing that outside of the Bible, right? It's within the text that a change is being made. So we want to look at some of the examples of this, but keep in mind that this is something that happens, and it happens for many different reasons.
I think in order to help set some of how we can see how this happens, because we're not going to go, there's very into the weeds ways to do this. But as we said, this is kind of the first of many. And so I think let's start with an example that maybe we're familiar with or more familiar with, and that can also introduce some of the ways we can see how this goes, Bob. And so I'm going to pull up on the screen here some parallel passages relating to Goliath. So these come to us from 1 Samuel 17. So on screen here, we've got 1 Samuel 17 in the Hebrew Bible, in the Septuagint, Josephus's retelling of it, and then a version of this from 4Q Samuel, one of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And as you know, in 1 Samuel 17, in the Hebrew Bible, we get this height of Goliath as 6 cubits and a span, or approximately 9'9". Septuagint, however, has him at 6'9", which is then we see that repeated in Josephus and in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So I think a couple things with this example. One, how do these different traditions work together to help us understand, the process of redaction historically? But also, two, what about the nature of this change? Because this feels like, we're talking 6999. Is this just an oopsie? Is this just a small mistake? Does this even matter? Are we reading? Because this is one of those where I think people look at it and say, you're blowing this out of proportion. We're just talking about a height here. And so let's start with the manuscripts and then get into some of the why, because I think that's an important thing to start with.
Yeah, this is a good one to start with because it's just it's a change of a number, right? In the Hebrew, you have 6 cubits and a span, which is going to make it about 9'9". And the Hebrew text says this. And then remember, the Septuagint is supposed to be the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. And in the letter of Aristeas, you have this incredibly compelling story that says, they went off in pairs, 72 of them, letter for letter. This thing is, perfect. And look, they came back and it's everybody's, oh, this is the best translation ever. Okay, well, if that's the case, how come this translation says 4 cubits in a span, right? Test with the 4 in a span, 6'9", 6 in a span, 9'9". So which is it? Clearly, he's huge, right?
Right.
He's going to play. He's going to be a center in the Philistine Basketball Association. But is he 9'9", like this much short of hitting his head on the rim, or is he 6'9", like a regular, power forward or a center in the PBA? The idea was always they must have miscopied it. The
The
Hebrews got it
Septuagint.
right. The Septuagint, made a mistake. They
Hmm.
made him smaller, right? And Josephus typically, by and large, follows the Septuagint,
Hmm.
as does the New Testament, by the way. About 80% of the time when they're quoting scripture, they're going to follow the Septuagint. That was the Bible of the time. And so it was, well, the Septuagint made the mistake and the Hebrew was right because we want Goliath to be big, right? It makes the story better. But then all along comes the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And sure enough, here in the Hebrew, you get 4 cubits and a span. And all of a sudden now we're realizing, oh, we've got this ancient source that actually has 4 cubits and a span. So maybe you actually had 4 cubits in a span in the Hebrew. It was properly transcribed into Greek, 4 cubits in a span. Josephus copied it properly, told the story properly. And somebody came along maybe after the Septuagint was created and wanted, it's like a fishtail, right? And the fish just keeps getting bigger.
Yeah.
And they increased the size of Goliath. Or, or you've got two versions of the Hebrew story going, one at 6'9" and one at 9'9". And the 4 cubits in a span, that one was the one that got translated and that one into the Septuagint, and that was the one that ended up at Qumran. So
Hmm.
you've got this alternate tradition that was being copied, floating around, and it ends up at 6 cubits in a span. The point being that either a change was made, it looks like during the Hebrew text, right? Or you've got two versions of the text floating around. Either way, it's a evidence that you've got different versions, either by a scribal change or just by various traditions. You've got different versions of the text floating around.
And this is why the presence of these different manuscripts is so important for our ability to do this. Because as you said, a lot of the times historically, the
Mhm.
Septuagint has been viewed as a not perfect translation, and the preference typically goes towards the Masoretic texts readings. A lot of times. Not always accurately though, because the Septuagint has been shown in some cases like this to agree with the Dead Sea
Mhm.
Scrolls. But why is it then when we see, if Josephus, if we put him to the side and we say, okay, the Dead Sea Scrolls have this one, and maybe they're just following the Septuagint, why should we side with maybe the 2 versus the 3? Is there anything within that the more we have, the better? Or is this just one of those, maybe the 9'9" feels like we're trying to pump up our hero. We make the giant bigger and bigger and bigger. And so that's why maybe the change happens.
Yeah, no, it's a lot of times people say, well, this has so many different manuscript traditions. Look, that's got to be, but if this one's the earlier one, if the one that's the outlier is the earliest, then you can claim, okay, that might be the earliest, but an early scribe may have told the fishtail, right?
Hmm.
Exaggerated something, and everybody likes the exaggerated tale, or that's the one that became the dominant manuscript tradition and goes on. And this one is actually earlier and more original. And I mean, you could make this argument if we looked at the New Testament. We won't do
Hmm.
that too much today, but if the earliest gospel written and Mark says something and Matthew and Luke come along and correct it because Jesus wasn't in the tomb, after 3 days, they make this change to on the third day, which is a little more, and then that's the tradition on the third day, just because it has more instances of doesn't mean that it's the original.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I'll steal Bart Ehrman's, if it's copies of copies of copies of copies of copies of copies, it is possible, believe it or not, to photocopy or to, hand copy the wrong thing over and over and over again. So as long as that error, that change is made very early, that's the issue. So sometimes it's done because we want to make the story look better. I mean, who doesn't want to look better, right? So you do that early on, and you just hope that manuscript tradition goes away.
And this is why you'll get some people talking about, like Emmanuel Tove, talking about almost 3 textual traditions, that you have the Hebrew Bible, the Masoretic text, as sometimes its own strand, sometimes the Septuagint standing as its own, and then the Dead Sea Scrolls as a third, sometimes overlapping, sometimes diverging. So if you're reading in critical scholarship and you're hearing about these different strands of text, those are typically the things that they're going to be talking about. They either are informing each other or disagreeing with each other. And I think, one that's too long to go into here, and we have a whole video about it as well, is the fuller David and Goliath story.
Right.
Go and check out that video for some more. Right. We'll put that in the description, but it gives us, between the Septuagint and the Hebrew text, what appear to be 2 traditions that have been brought together, where we have a shorter version in the Septuagint, and the Hebrew Bible just keeps, adding on, and you have somebody showing up and then being introduced, David being introduced, and then having to be reintroduced later, and the back and forth. And so these things within the text they're all over the place.
Right. So the evidence of this redaction comes, David and Goliath, he gets introduced 3 or 4 times, right? It's like, whose son is this? And it's like, you already met him. You already hired him. He already works for you.
Yes.
It's this kind of thing. And of course, it becomes a theological concern later on among the rabbis, because they have to go back and explain, well, why doesn't he know who he is? It's because, the Lord did something. Somebody did something they have to rationalize it within the canon. But it's because they can't just admit somebody made a change to the text or somebody merged 2 texts together, because that is out of the question. That's not something that they can admit takes place, except in the places where the early rabbis said, no, 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 no. Clearly the text was altered.
Yes.
And I think we have a few examples of those that we can talk about a little later, but there are some instances where the rabbis clearly understood the biblical text was changed for theological reasons, for political reasons, right? But it's to make God look better. And they knew, while the text, we know what you're trying to say, but we're going to flip the text around so that it's abundantly clear that we're not offending God in any way.
Well, I think let's go to one of these theological, political examples. And to do that, I want to go through some of Genesis 18 and some of Genesis 16. And this is one of those God appearing moments, which is where we normally get some edits happening later on. And Dan McClellan has a whole book that's free for you to access all about this if you're interested. And this is one of those scenes in Genesis 16 where a divine messenger shows up. But I think let's start here and go through some of Genesis 18 first, because it makes Genesis 16, I think, feel a little bit more theological and political. And so in Genesis 18, what we have first is the Lord appearing to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre. As he sat at the entrance of the tent in the heat of the day, he looks up and he saw 3 men standing near him. And this is when he goes out, he runs out, he prepares a meal for them. We're not going to read through all of this all together, because I want to jump down to near the end when we have a scene that you're likely familiar with. And the Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old? Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? At the set time I will return to you in due season, and Sarah shall have borne a son.' But Sarah denied, saying, 'I did not laugh,' for she was afraid. He said, 'Oh yes, you did laugh.'" And so again, this is one of those childbearing stories, a story that we're familiar with, but we've got a couple things.
Mhm.
One, we've got God showing up in person to
Mhm.
talk to Abraham and Sarah here,
Mhm.
and direct interactions. Maybe surprisingly, no angel of the Lord. This is just God, right?
Right. Yeah, no, this is one of those things. Again, early on, you have this very anthropomorphic understanding of God where there's three men, right? And the understanding is what this is not is the Trinity, right? So let's just, this concept doesn't exist at the time. So let's get rid of that idea. But this is God and what? It could be two angels. It could be, traveling. We don't know. But what it is God speaking directly to Abram, right? He's talking to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre, and he's saying he's basically having an argument, and he's like, you know, talking to Sarah.
Mm-hmm.
She's like, why did she laugh? I didn't laugh. Oh, yes, you did
Yes, you
laugh. I
did
heard
laugh.
you. Don't you dare doubt me. Don't you tell me I'm God. You know, he's doing this with a human
Mm-hmm.
on a one-to-one level. Why? Because this is the God of Abraham and God, and they can do that. They're intimate. They're besties, right? This is the patriarch of Israel, and this is God, and they can do this, right? They're going to negotiate. They're going to
Yes.
you know how this he does some pretty bold stuff with God, and so he talks directly to God.
And we have that one. Talks directly with God. That's kind of our.
Mhm.
Now there's other things if you're looking at that and you're like, wait a minute, are they're making a meal for God? God is going to eat food and the food is not kosher food either. Yes, we could come back. There's lots more to be said there, but we want to set that one up to get to step back in time a little bit. Genesis 16 for a
Right.
comparison here when Hagar is in the situation. The angel of the Lord found her, and this her is Hagar, by the spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur.
Mhm.
And he said, Hagar, slave girl of Sarai, where have you come from? Where are you going? She said, I'm running away from my mistress. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her. The angel of the Lord also said to her, I will so greatly multiply your offspring that they cannot be counted for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, now you have conceived and shall bear a son. You shall call him Ishmael, for the Lord has given heed to your affliction. He shall be a wild ass of a man with his hand against everyone and everyone's hand against him, and he shall live at odds with his kin. So she named the Lord who spoke to her, You are El Roy, for she said, have I really seen God and remained alive after seeing him? And so I wanted to set up Genesis 18 first to this one because, again, we have a birthing story. But
Right.
here with Hagar, angel of the Lord, Bob.
Yeah,
Why?
isn't this interesting? All of a sudden, by the way, if I'm not mistaken, this is the earliest mention of the word malach, right? This is the earliest mention of an angel in the Hebrew Bible. This
Yeah,
is
if
the
you're if
first
you're
time we
reading
see
from
them.
well, I mean, when we're saying earliest, we're saying like starting at the beginning.
Yeah,
Genesis 1:1 and reading
pardon
up.
me. This is the first time
Yeah.
we encounter the word angel in the Bible. Um, and it says, an angel of the Lord found her. An angel of the Lord said to her. An angel of the Lord said to her. And so we're like, well, God talks directly to Abraham and to Sarah, but here all of a sudden you have an angel of the Lord saying this. But then in reply, well, first of all, you've got the angel of the Lord saying, the angel of the Lord said to her, I, first person, will so greatly multiply your offspring that they cannot be counted.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, first of all, time out, angel of the Lord. Who are you? This is God's job to do this, not you. You're not the one who multiplies things. This is God's job.
Right.
So please don't usurp the power of God. And the angel of the Lord, now you've conceived. Okay, that's fine. Gabriel, you're going to conceive.
An
Okay, fine.
announcement.
Right. It's announcement. You shall call him as for the Lord has given heed to your affliction. Right. So she named, get this in verse 13, the Lord who spoke to her, not the angel of the Lord who spoke to her. She named the Lord
Mm-hmm.
who spoke to her. This is the divine name.
This is the
This is
divine name.
God, the God who spoke to her, the Lord who spoke to her. You are El Roi, right? For he said, have I really, and we don't really know what this says here in the Hebrew, right? But it's something like, have I seen and am still seeing, or something like that. But it's something to the effect of, I'm still here and I've seen God, not an angel
Not
of
an
the
angel.
God of God. I've seen God and I'm still alive, right? And therefore she names this thing. So here's the question. The text says that this angel of the Lord says, I will multiply you.
Mm-hmm.
And then it says, she is naming the Lord this name because I have seen God. But the first three instances up there, it's an angel of the Lord, an angel of the Lord, an angel of the Lord. And this is the first time we see, at least in the Bible, that we see the word angel appear. What's interesting is if you go through the Hebrew and you just take out the word angel, it's malach, right? It's in the construct. So if you just read it, it could very easily say, and the Lord found her. You just pull out the word angel. That's all you got to do. And the Lord found her by his spring, verse 10. And the Lord also said to her, verse 9, the Lord said to her, return to your mistress. The Lord also said to her, I will greatly multiply your offspring so that they can't be counted. And the Lord said to her, now you have conceived and will bear a son, for the Lord has given heed to your affliction. If you do that, the text makes so much more sense.
Yeah.
So then she named the Lord El Roi,
Well,
because have I really seen God and am still here?
and this scene, I mean, when we're talking about these birthing scenes, there's so many parallels here between, with Genesis 18 and Sarah, but also some of these promises to Abraham, I will make your descendants like this feels like, if you take out angel of the Lord, this lines right up with those other moments.
Right.
But, despite Genesis 18 coming after this, where
Right.
God can just show up, here it needs to be mediated, but maybe not totally fixed. But what is it about this then, Bob,
Well,
that makes it that there needs to be a mediator that God, they're uncomfortable. Later editors are uncomfortable with God appearing to Hagar when God can appear to Abraham and Sarah in Genesis 18.
yeah, isn't this interesting, right? You have this angel of the Lord, angel of the Lord, angel of the Lord, and then it's just she in her response, she's like, I have seen God. And it's no, you apparently, according to that, you've seen the angel of the Lord. You haven't seen the Lord. But her responses, and one of the angel's responses is, I will do this to. So it appears that somebody came in and added the word angel in front of the divine name in the construct. So it's all you got to do is in Hebrew, you just add the word angel so that there's a little distance between God and Hagar, right? So it's not God talking to her like he talks to Sarah, like he talks to Abraham, that it's an angel of the Lord talking to Hagar, but they didn't do it all the way through and they didn't change the response, but they just wanted to put some distance between God and Hagar. So then the question we have to ask is, why are they doing this?
Right.
What on earth would cause a scribe at a later date to come back into Genesis 16 and say, we have no problem with God in looking like a human, because it says three men, right? So in an anthropomorphic looking God, right, in Genesis 18, an anthropomorphic manifestation of the deity talking to Abraham, no problem with that. But with Hagar, who's going to give birth to Ishmael, Ishmael, who was understood to be the father of what would become the Arab peoples, according to the biblical tradition, we can't have God talking to her. And so let's put a little distance in there. And I think that's what's going on. I'm not the first to think this, right? We need to get Dan McClellan in here.
Well, and yeah, if you're wanting to read more, I mean, definitely
Right.
recommend his book. He does include this in one of his chapters as an example of angel being inserted, for these reasons as this distancing. But it is it's so close to this other one that it feels both theological and so political.
Right, and that's what it is. At a later date, when when this was first written, it was God shows up, God does this, God does that, there's one God. That's what there is. There's one. And so he's doing this stuff and people, but at a later period, when this stuff is being collected, when it's being edited, when it's being redacted, at a period where there's been a lot of history and we don't necessarily like certain peoples. You see this with the Samaritans.
Mm-hmm.
You can see this with Arabs. You can see this with all of these different individuals. You can just angels, we like angels. By the way, it's done at a time where the concept of angels is now more popular,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's you don't have angels early on. You have one God. But when you come back from exile, now you've got messengers from God. And so we'll just put it in here, put it in here, put it in here. And now you've put just a little distance between God and Hagar, and you've accomplished this secondary feat of God's not talking directly to Hagar, the mother, the one through whom Ishmael, right? That the Arab peoples claim their descent from Abraham. And so it's a little political thing, but it's something that appears to have happened, because if you take the word angel out of those early verses, the text makes a lot more sense.
It makes perfect. I mean, it works.
Right.
It works with
Right.
it. You can read
Right.
through and you just keep plowing along and you're like, yeah, okay. But it makes so much sense within the other scenes. It feels right at home taking that out. And I want, staying in Genesis 18 before we move on to some other examples, look at one other, I think, of these theological discomforts that you had mentioned. You know, sometimes modern scholars are looking at this going, things like angel here of, oh, maybe this was inserted. That in Genesis 18:22 is one of these references where for a while people have been looking at this and saying, maybe this has changed. And so after the whole meeting at the tent, this is when the men are going on their way. They're going towards Sodom, and they have left, and we have Abraham and the Lord there. And verse 22 says, so the men turned from there and went towards Sodom, while Abraham remained standing before the Lord. But this is one of those examples where scholars look at this and say, feels like there's been a change here. Bob, what changed? Because this seems to read just fine. What's the argued change here?
Yeah. And again, this isn't something that modern scholars came up with. This is something that ancient scholars and scribes came up with. This is a tikkun sofrim, right? This is one of the many tikkunei soferim. These are the edits made to the text of the Hebrew Bible that ancient scholars, rabbis, looked and said, clearly there was a change made to the text here to protect against anyone thinking that we were insulting God. Now, there's not an overt insult here, but just to make sure that nobody happens to think that this, very, very careful, they probably made a change to the text. And look at the context of it. The Lord, remember, these three guys are standing there, and they're revealing to Abram what's about to happen. And the two of them, remember, these are the two men that show up on lots, right? They're going to leave and go down and do the thing. And so because they leave, this leaves only God standing there before Abraham, which is probably what the text originally said, right? God says, I must go down and see whether or not they have done according to their outcry, and if not, I will know. So the men turned from there and went towards Sodom, and the text probably originally said, while the Lord remained standing before Abram. Right? Then Abram came near and said, will you indeed do this thing that you said you're going to do? But as the years went by, some people probably said, wait a minute, God isn't just a king, he's God. And the king doesn't wait before anyone. It's just a king doesn't wait on anyone. You wait for the king. And so what they probably did was, instead of it saying, and went toward Sodom while the Lord remained standing for him, the other two men left while the Lord remained standing before Abram. They just switched those two while Abram remained standing for the Lord. And then Abram came near and said, So it reads just fine. Most people don't recognize it, but some early rabbis looked at that and said, no, no, this is one of those instances where it appears a change has been made just to defend against anybody who might say we have offended God. And like I said, it reads fine without it, but they identified that one as clearly this isn't how it originally read, but now it's better.
And it's one of those, yeah, it doesn't change the meaning of the scene. The people that were
Mm-mm.
there are still there, but a
Right,
slight theological fix of what's
right,
the
right,
relationship. Although, we just had Abraham defending, arguing, bartering, and we have
right,
Sarah lying to God. We
right,
don't need to
right,
fix that part.
right.
Sarah lying to God just fine. We're comfortable with this. But the standing, we've got to make a switch, which is one of these things where when you're looking through some of these, it's a moment where you go, you fixed that, but not this. You
Well,
fixed this, but not that.
it's the same with the non-kosher meal, right?
Yes.
Abram goes up there and he gets him some meat and some milk and he hands it to God. And I was like, you think you'd fix that one, right? And instead, this one, yeah, nobody's going to be offended by this. We know what you're trying to say, but the milk and the meat, come on. But that apparently at the time wasn't a thing. They hadn't received the law yet or something. They could, even though they have a thing that says all the law was known since the beginning. Anyways, this one, not a big deal, but there are other ones, a little bit bigger deal.
Let's look at one of these other theological ones that's a slightly bigger deal
Right.
that connects back to some things we've talked about before. This one comes
Mhm.
from Deuteronomy 32:8, and we have up on the screen here the English version that comes from the Hebrew text, the Masoretic text, as well as what we see in the Septuagint. Because in Deuteronomy 32:8, we get this verse: when the Most High apportioned the nations, when he divided humankind, he fixed the boundaries of the peoples according to the numbers of the sons of Israel, is what we have in the Hebrew. The Septuagint gives us a slightly different reading. When the Most High was apportioning nations, as he scattered Adam's sons, he fixed boundaries of the nations according to the number of divine sons. So, well, on the one hand, I think we need to talk about what's going on with the Most High at the beginning, and then we need to focus on the difference there at the end. First, what's going on with this scene that we've got a Most High doing something, and then sons of Israel and divine sons, Bob.
Yeah. Well, first of all, in the Septuagintal translation there, I would say, are we going to read that as divine sons or are we going to read that as angels of God, right? So, and you can see where these translations are coming from because the whole concept here is problematic from the beginning, right? When the Most High apportioned the nation, so God is basically saying, you guys are going to get this, you guys are going to get this, you guys are going to get this land over here. Basically, the argument is this is how different peoples were given different lands.
Mm-hmm.
Why are the Egyptians here, and why are the Assyrians here? Well, it's because God apportioned the lands. You guys get this land, you guys get this land. By the way, my people are going to get the promised land. They've got to come and take it first. But so God's apportioning the lands. And he says, when he did this, he divided humankind and he fixed the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the sons of Israel. Well, why would all the peoples of the other nations, be apportioned to the 12 sons of Israel? That really doesn't make any sense. And so people looked at, why would there's more than 12 nations, and B, why would all the foreign nations be determined by the number of the sons of Israel? And so people started looking at this. They went to the Septuagint, and the Septuagint, when it's translated, says numbers of the angelon theo, right?
Mm-hmm.
The the angels of God, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
What do they mean by this? Is this the sons of God? Is it the messengers of God? Are they divine? What's going on here? And so people are struggling with what's he trying to say? So then what do we need to look at? We discover the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yes. which has the sons of the Elohim in the Dead Sea Scrolls, because we get these versions, but yeah, we have multiple variations here where that goes to the gods. Samaritan Pentateuch reads towards the sons of Israel, and so we've got some back and forth. Dead Sea Scrolls and Septuagint reading in one direction, but not totally agreeing, because you do have angels, which sometimes they do it like that divine sons, where they're kind of mixing the two of these together, or reading fully with angels. Another where it's the sons of Israel. But there's the discomfort with this divine council scene, because we also, when we're talking about the Most High, this is when the Most High apportioned the nations. We're talking about a divine council moment up there with Elyon, right? We've got another one of these Elyon moments that's sneaking in here.
Right. And, I talk a lot about Elyon in my book on Melchizedek, right? Because he comes up there. But notice that when we talked about David and Goliath, we talked about Goliath at the beginning, you had 6:9 and 9:9, and then you had the Septuagint being reinforced by Josephus, and then the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls said, oh, look, it's the Septuagint. So that was kind of the tiebreaker.
Right.
But when you come here, you've got sons of Israel. That doesn't make any sense. You've got the number of angels of God. Well, why would God apportion the lands of the nations based upon the number of angels of God? That doesn't look right. And say, well, let's see what the Dead Sea Scrolls say. That'll be the tiebreaker. And they say the sons of God, which doesn't match either of those, but is probably maybe a better answer. But you can see why it would be such a problematic answer theologically. And yet it matches so many other texts in the Bible. It's probably the right answer, or closer to it, right? Because you've got some Septuagintal manuscripts that actually say sons of God, like you do in Genesis 6, right? When the sons of God came down and
or Nephilim.
These Nephilim. You've also got this notion that every one of these nations, right? Every one of these peoples had their own national god. The Egyptians had their gods, Syrians had their gods, Israelites have their god, right? And so when the Most High, when Elyon, who, if you go back to the Phoenician pantheon, this is Elyon. This is one of the deities. And when he is fixing the boundaries, the peoples, he's apportioning it based upon the sons of God, which works, but not when you're in a monotheistic context, not after you've equated Elyon with God, with the Hebrew God. But it makes more sense when you're saying, oh, this people has this land because they've got this God, and this people has this land because they have this God, and he's apportioning the land according to the gods.
And this is, I think it's again of just like before, one of these, you fix this part, but you don't fix that part. The selectivity of what gets uncomfortable, because verse 9, the Lord's own portion was his people, Jacob his allotted share. So we're uncomfortable saying that the sons of God are the ones up there. But here, the Most High is apportioning the Lord's own. So,
he took his own portion.
It gets harmonized up. Right. That's God talking. God was in verse 8 as the one apportioning, and God takes. But it could also just be read to say that someone else is doing the dividing. And God's portion is Israel, yes, and this is how we get they have theirs and they have theirs. But that part doesn't get so explicitly fixed here. We fix it, but they don't.
But that's what he's doing. Even if you harmonize those two, it's God's handing this land to those people based on their God, this land based on their gods, and he's keeping Israel for himself. And of course, the objection is, wait a minute, what is God doing talking or certainly acknowledging other gods, but much less handing out land and peoples to these other gods? I thought we were a monotheistic religion. What are all these polytheistic texts doing there? Surely that can't be the case. So they changed the text, and they changed it to the sons of Israel instead of the sons of God, which Doesn't make any sense, but at least it gets rid of the polytheism. All polytheism gone in the Bible, right?
Well, let's jump to one other example, staying on the sons of God. If we jump to Psalms, Psalm 29:1 reads,
Right.
Ascribe to the Lord. NRSV has it, O heavenly beings, ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. But what they
Mhm.
translate as heavenly beings here in the Hebrew is B'nai Elohim. In the Greek, the sons of God. So we have in Psalm 29:1, we're okay with there being, maybe the English translation moves it a little bit, but the sons of God can exist if they're ascribing glory to God, but the sons of God
Mhm.
in Deuteronomy need to go away. The divine council scenes, there's lots of them. And so
There
if you're
are.
thinking like I want to get into this, let us know. It's something we can look at because there's many happening around here. But sons of God show up, get fixed, don't get fixed. They're allowed to be there when they're bad or when they're praising, but when they might be something else, Deuteronomy, we want to fix them.
Mhm.
They're busy with the edits and they're not quite talking to each other all the time. It's like, they've got a document open and four people are making edits and they're not all talking to each other about what their style of editing is because somebody fixed and somebody else didn't fix. But it's just a part of the long nature, right? It was
Well,
problematic at one time and not at another.
they didn't have Google Docs yet where you can all edit on the same document. They didn't, and we haven't even talked about Psalm 89 yet, right? We haven't even talked about this text where it's God and the what. And again, I want to point out on Psalm 29, oh heavenly beings. No, just translate what it says, sons of God. But it's hard to sell Bibles when you talk
Yes.
about the sons of God, right? So they make it heavenly beings or whatever. But this is what it is. This is what it says. They acknowledged these other gods. You're not
Mm-hmm.
supposed to worship them, but this psalm is
But,
saying, ascribe to the Lord, the
mm-hmm.
Hebrew God, this one, all of you other gods, ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. You guys, all you other gods, need to be worshiping this God like we do, right? That was a common thing. But there came a time at a later date where there are no other gods. There's just one God. It went from monolatry to monotheism.
Mm-hmm.
And these texts then become problematic. And Psalm 89, do we have that? Do you have that
Yeah,
one?
yeah.
Yeah. Psalm 89 just becomes well, you've got it. Go ahead.
Well, where do you want to start?
I don't know. Anytime you've got a divine counsel, right? You've got a couple of these Psalms that are talking about um when the Lord goes before the divine council and he takes his seat and he's judging before the divine council. Uh, how can a psalm possibly talk about the Lord and these other gods, right? And sometimes they're just happy enough to let these sit, and so you get translations like the divine, instead of saying the God and the sons of God or the gods and the other gods, or they just say, well, his divine counsel. I
Yes.
I, I don't have the translation
Well,
right
like
here in front
in
of me.
89:7, a God feared in the council of the holy ones, great and awesome above all that are around him.
There you go.
And so you get
So
these, yeah, more of this council imagery, but very much, we're okay with some of the council when we have our ordering in place and we can got it, on top. We're maybe more comfortable.
right. No, it's is again, you've got this. I'm trying to think of, and maybe somebody can type it in there, but I'm trying to think when God takes his place. It's not coming uh to the top of my head here. Psalm 82, sorry. Look at Psalm 82. Psalm 82 says, and here's how the English translation has it here for NRSV. God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment,
Mm-hmm.
right? But what you've actually got is Elohim has stand or is standing, has stood in the council of El,
Mm-hmm.
is what it says. So is Elohim and El the same thing? How, so they translate this as divine counsel. And then you go down a little further and it says, in the midst of the gods, he will judge, or something like that. So you clearly have some kind of a reference to a, a collection, a gathering of multiple deities, some
Yeah.
kind of, they translate it as divine council, but you're dealing here, Claire, and it's not changed. They left that one right there. But over here, when they're apportioning the nations, for some reason, they felt the need to go in there and change it because they didn't want that one. But the Psalms, we'll fix that poetically.
Psalms, we get all kinds of stuff in the
Right,
Psalms
right.
coming up. I mean, blessed is the one that dashes the babies on the stones. In any other context, that's one of
Right,
those
right.
lines where you're like, nobody comes through and takes this out. But that one gets to stay.
Yeah.
That one gets to stay in there. I think as we're wrapping up here, I want to jump to an example where the English translations do some fixing for what's in the text. And this is coming from Job, and an example that is one of those, again, that people may be familiar with. And a couple verses here in Job 1:5, 1:11, and 2:9, where we have in the English, in Job 1:5, Job said, "It may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." But the one everyone is probably more familiar with is 2:9, and this is Job's wife. Then his wife said to him, "Do you still persist in your integrity? Curse God and die." However, this isn't what the Hebrew actually says here.
No,
They're
no.
they're reading in for us a fix. So Bob, what does the Hebrew say, and
Yeah.
why does the NRSV read in a fix for us?
And don't get me wrong, the NRSV in this case is making an appropriate English translation, right? And most English
Yes.
translations do this because they knew of this tradition. And the tradition is you can never put the word arur, right? The word curse and God next to each other because you're basically saying curse God. And you cannot do that. You can't do it. And so what you have here, essentially, Mrs. Job in 2:9, Mrs. Job is saying, do you still persist in your integrity? And when you read the Hebrew, it says, bless God
Mm-hmm.
and die, which makes no sense, right? She's mad. Mrs. Job is mad. She's like, why are you still worshiping this God? She wants to say, curse this God and die. Just get it
Mm-hmm.
over with. He's taken everything. Why do you persist? I'm going to be loyal to this God. Why? Right? Curse him and die. But they cannot, as scribes, write the word curse next to the word God. So they write bless God and die. But again, all of the scribes, the rabbis, knew this tradition. We can't do that. It's like seeing the tetragrammaton. It's like seeing the name of the Hebrew God, but you cannot pronounce it.
Mm-hmm.
So you say Adonai instead.
You're right.
It's just the convention.
It's
You're
known.
not, there came a point, even though we're writing it, you can't speak the name of the Lord. So you say Adonai, you say Lord. It's just the convention. And they knew this convention. When it says bless God, they would say bless God out loud, but everyone in the building knows that what he's saying is curse God. And in the English tradition, right, in our tradition, there's not that sensitivity towards saying curse God together because
Mm-hmm.
it's not offensive to our ears. And so we go, well, yeah, she's saying that, but she's wrong. She shouldn't be saying that, right? But that's what she's trying to impart, even though that's not what the Hebrew says.
But it is, yes, it's one of those examples where the English for us is reading something in. And it's just one of these examples of redaction is still ongoing. Because if you're looking at an English Bible here, this is an example in our translation of we're making a fix to make this make sense with what's happening here. We're not trying to say that this isn't what's there. And there's usually a note that accompanies this. There's a little footnote or something in the margin that's saying the Hebrew actually says this. But if you're
Right.
just reading through the text and you're making a copy of a copy of a copy, this is one of those, hey, there's a marginal note that explains this, which is the same thing that we have in ancient manuscripts, that there are marginal notes where people are explaining things that sometimes work their way into manuscripts. or sometimes because of marginal notes work their way out of manuscripts because I left
Right.
this out. Let me write it in the side. And eventually
Right,
somebody later sees that and goes, oh, that's just
Right.
extra. I'm going to leave it out. And this here for the English, I wanted to throw this one at the end of an example where the translation, we are still doing this, not just, in a scholarly way of what's the oldest manuscript that we have, but as we're translating this, our translations and our harmonizations, whether we acknowledge them or not, we're doing internal redaction as we read to fix these things.
Yeah, this is true. And you mentioned these marginalia, these notes in the side. This is where you get a lot of these, and it is called this until this day.
Yes.
Right? So that could be original to the text. It's called this, and we still call it that. The person writing it down could be writing that, but that could also be a scribe writing it, and then somebody copying it, and somebody saying, this is also called the name of what it's called today, and we call it this to this day. And some subsequent scribe reading that in the margin saying, oh, did he leave this out? And he doesn't want to start a new page. And so am I supposed to add this? And so they just add it into the text and the text grows. But again, that's not a theological change. It's just more of a clarification. As opposed to some of these things where they're clearly making theological changes. I talk about some of these in my Melchizedek book when you get to a point where those in Jerusalem have a serious issue with those in Samaria. And so they start changing things in the text to promote either Jerusalem or to promote Samaria. And then the question is, who's changing? Is the Samaritan Pentateuch the one making the alterations, or is it the Hebrew Bible? Because there comes a point where they differ from each other, and it's on issues like sometimes it's a tiny little one letter, the place that he will choose versus the place that he chose. And sometimes there's just an 11th commandment. There's just a whole other commandment that says, by the way, you're going to worship here on Mount Gerizim.
Well, we hope that you've enjoyed this foray, let's say an introduction into some of this, because as you're hearing here at the end, there's too many examples to fit into any 1 hour. So we'll be coming back to this topic. If you have questions related to either passages that we covered or didn't cover that you would like to see us discuss or discuss with anyone, go ahead and leave those in the comments. We're happy to look over that and take your suggestions in for future episodes. But we're so happy for everyone that joined us live today. Thank you so much. We're happy to have you with us. If you're watching on replay, we look forward to seeing you maybe at a live in the future next week. We'll be back at 11 a.m. Central on Friday. So an afternoon, maybe a lunchtime listen, or, throw us in your ears at work. We promise we won't tell your boss. You're just listening to a podcast. But until then, for all of us here at Bible and Archaeology, I'm Jordan Jones. For Bob Cargill, thank you for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you next week.